Oh no, here it comes.
There we go.
Perfect.
Good.
Yeah, all good. Thank you. Got there.
Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about the detail a little bit more of how you scope your project and how you define what you're going to do, and also look back retrospectively on a couple of projects in a bit of detail to actually look and explore the outcomes, the end result. The outcomes more than just those of a completed and beautifully conserved sort of building. A little bit about these are the topics I'm going to cover. We're all here as part of the third sector, and I think it's worth just exploring why we're doing that. But I shall run through most of these things fairly quickly. But the third sector is quite important. My background is that I trained as an architect, and I won the SPAB Letherby Scholarship in the late 70s, which gave me a year studying historic buildings. I was particularly, and their repair, I was particularly concerned with the numbers of buildings in severe state of dereliction that we saw during the 12 months of the scholarship. And my interest in coming out of the scholarship was very much focused on problem buildings and solving them. And I quickly realized that third sector projects were really one of the only ways in which you could do really challenging projects. These are a couple of the ones that I've been involved in. This is Clevedon Pier in 1972, grade 1 listed structure. Not many options for a pier, it has to be said. But as you can see, the end part of the pier had collapsed after load testing. And then about 15 years later, after a very long program of works, fundraising, some really technical structural repairs, things like that, we managed to get the project finished. And likewise, another project, Highcliffe Castle, set on fire by its developers, a terrible ruin, a grade 1 listed building, and then some 10 years later, a really wonderful asset, fully repaired and in use by the community. Now, these are both undertaken by third sector organisations that many of you will represent, that have a wider interest than just money or the cost of the building. And indeed, they are an essential part of what we do in the world of conservation with buildings that are at risk. And the reason behind it is quite simply that wherever you have, where the costs are greater than the project value, there's a deficit. And if you can meet the deficit with grants, then you can create value. And that's a really useful thing to do. But that deficit is called the conservation deficit, and it's very much at the fundament of what we have to do in the early stages, is to identify what that conservation deficit is and to find ways around meeting it. So it's a quite simple equation, where the value equals the cost less the grants. Now, we're here because commercial developers find grants very hard to get. So if they can't balance value and costs on a project, then they're not going to do it. But where buildings have fallen into dereliction, that are difficult to use or have fallen out of use, this equation almost certainly doesn't work. The costs are so much higher, the value is lower, and hence there's a role for us. And of course, in terms of the heritage sector, the third sector, value for the third sector means much more than its financial value at the end of the day. It's all the other things that the project delivers and the activities. Just quickly to discuss the difference between a feasibility study and an options appraisal, because I'm going to focus on an options appraisal. Where you have an idea of something that you'd like to do and you need a building to put it in and choose it, the idea comes first. It might be you have a group that wants to play basketball and you need to find somewhere to house them. Does the building you choose will your basketball team and all it needs fits in that building? That's what I refer to as a feasibility study. But where you have a building and you're trying to come up with the ideas of what goes into that building to test and see if they work, then that's an options appraisal. And the objective of both studies is to define the project that you're undertaking for yourselves and for others and its scope. But I'm going to concentrate on options appraisals today. I like to think of options appraisals working in 3 stages from developing the ideas through to the options. The first stage is building an understanding. It's really, really important that the decisions that organisations like yours make are based on facts, on an understanding, so that they're informed. Supposition, guessing, all those sorts of ways of approaching things, dreaming, doesn't actually establish what the facts are. And so it's really important to build that understanding. The second stage is, once you understand that the building, is to explore what the options are. And that needs to be a genuine exploration, looking at everything, every possible use that might go in, if only to rule some of them out so that you can demonstrate that you've done so. And then the last stage is to develop what your preferred option is. So in that first stage, what sort of things do we need to do? Well, we very quickly got to get a handle on what the physical building is, how big it is, its size, its condition, its built form. Does it have big spaces, little spaces? Is it cellular? Does it have lots of cellular spaces? And you can imagine, just imagine, say, a prison compared to a listed aircraft hangar. They're going to be completely different in those characteristics. So it's quite important to understand them. The second issue is the building's asset value. How important is it? The more important it is, the more sensitive to change it will be. Its importance is usually registered in its statutory designation, whether it's a listed building, a scheduled ancient monument, a registered parkland, or something like that. It's important to understand the sequence of its construction. So under this category, you might want to do a conservation statement or a conservation management plan, probably too early at the stage where you're doing an options appraisal, but certainly a way of building an understanding of the building and its historic value, not just physically, but socially, the value to its community, the people who live there, those sorts of things. You need to understand its settings, its surrounding, its context. Where does it sit? You know, a building sat next to an abattoir and a railway station is going to have quite a different set of problems to a building in the middle of a field next to a church in a rural shire. The key issue that's been talked about today already is ownership. Nothing will happen without a route to ownership. Funders won't give grants to buildings that you don't own. The attitude and aspiration of the owner will be very significant. If they're compliant and they're anxious to solve out a problem they have, that's good. That's one thing that will help. But very often with some of the buildings you'll be looking at, the owners think they're sitting on a gold mine, they don't want to sell it, they want to develop it, knock it down, then it can be a different matter altogether. And your options appraisal may then become part of a bigger set of documentation leading up to a CPO. And ownership also includes, in my view, the users and uses that are in the building at the moment. You might actually have an owner that isn't looking after the building very well, but a user who rents it, who would love to stay there and would be a very good user. You need to understand the planning of the statutory context. What consents are you going to need? Not just planning and listed building consent, but for example, if you've got a water course running under or near your building, you might have to have an environment agency consent, things like that. If you're in Wales, you've probably got all sorts of, and indeed in England, you'll have issues over ecology and consents from Natural England, and things like that. You need to understand the regional and local context of the economy and how they're going to impact on your project, particularly values. The values at the end of the day are what finding the money will be based on. and it is important to have a clear understanding of what those are. The next item, and again, it's been talked with at some length earlier, is what are the community objectives and stakeholding? And you need to initiate consultations very early on to try and make sure that you get a good understanding, a good handle on what people around the building and on who it's going to impact and have a stakeholding in it, what they're going to think, what they might contribute to the project, and how they might help. Public access is it public buildings? Do people go in there? Is it a school that people have a pattern of use of? Do you want to have public access? Does your particular building have an interior that's worth seeing? So again, the scope of public access, it's no point having a great historic building that you rescue, put into wonderful use, but no one can get inside to see it. Then in this early stage, you do need to also flag up some of the really important issues. Does it flood? Does it suffer from contamination? Are there covenants that affect the ownership and those sorts of things? And then lastly, do you need to do anything very fast to make sure that the building's still there when you finish your study, and better that it's still there in 5 or 6 years' time when you've got the money to do on it? Now that first stage forms what I call the definition of the envelope of constraints on the project. It's within that envelope that you will find a solution that you can deliver. If it's not within the envelope, you probably won't be able to do it. The second stage then is to explore the options. Now that's not just physical, it's also, you know, who might your potential partners be, as the case study that Nicola and Rosie talked about earlier demonstrated very clearly that that's quite important, building partnerships. In terms of those uses and options, what's the market and the demand for them? What are the values, the rents, the income? Or what's the likelihood of visitors? Is it a good visitor location, destination? What numbers are you talking about and what will they pay? You need to assess the fit between the uses and the building to identify whether you can actually bring this building back into the use options with an acceptable level of change. So you need to do some preliminary design work. Now that will be informed by the conservation statement, your understanding that you built in the first stage of this work. Sometimes you need to add additional space to a building, again, as in your previous case study, and you may need to alter it internally. So what are the options for you doing that? Every building these days you have to get to, so you need to be able to identify access, parking, and transport links. It may be that you have a very large building on a very constrained site with no easy route to access, and that will have a big impact on the options that it can accommodate. Giving the project some sort of scale, what are the scope of work? What do you need to do? Comparatively, what are the capital and development costs? So you actually look at each of those options and try and put numbers against it to get an order of magnitude cost and a feel of the comparison. And then equally looking at the funding options. Are these uses fundable? Is the building fundable, the quality? And again, I would endorse that what was said earlier is that, you know, don't change your project or evaluate your options simply on the basis of whether they're going to get funding. You've got to look much broadly about that, more broadly on that. Another one that is quite important, particularly when, as we've found in the last few years, capital and revenue can be very short, is are there any options for enabling development? Is there something else you can do, either on the same site or perhaps nearby, which can improve the values that you've got and the resources that you have available that you can then reinvest in the project? So enabling development can be quite important. And then lastly, for each of those use options, one wants to look at the comparative financial operational models. How will it operate? How will it work? And again, consultations. So at the end of that stage, you've got to a place where you can take a balanced view of what the options are and you can make a decision about what your preferred one. And then that leads to the third stage of when you define your preferred option, you develop it a little bit further. So clearly you need drawings, and that will come from your design team, ideally to what was to one of the early RIBA stages, stage 1 or 2. You need to understand what your conservation strategy is going to be, so that you can be sure that you'll be able to get them through Historic England and the Planning Conservation Officer. You need to define, particularly important, increasingly important, what your sustainability objectives are going to be for the building, the site around it. Develop your cost plan in much more detail. You need to look at the long-term costs of the building. No funder is going to give you a very large sum of money if in 5 or 6 years' time the building is going to be falling back into disrepair. And so they're going to be looking for you to actually understand exactly what the long-term maintenance costs are going to be, the cyclical maintenance costs and your operating maintenance costs, and to have built those into your business plan. A preliminary financial model for your business plan, and then looking at your organisation structure and resources. Do you have the capacity and capability to do this project? And if not, what do you need to do them? Projects are always more successful when they involve partnerships, particularly partnerships between local authorities and third sector organisations. Those are often really important when you're tackling very difficult projects. You need to be fairly clear towards the end of stage 3 what acquisition terms may be, and have some draft heads of agreement on those. A programme, which needs to be realistic, and very often some of the big issues we find that programmes are dictated by the cut-off date for funding streams and force clients into very difficult and unsustainable decisions. And then once again, consultations and building stakeholder and community support. So those are the components I would consider pretty essential for an options appraisal on a challenging, substantial historic building. Now, there are other inputs. And again, as you've heard in the case study previously, this isn't just an architectural study. It involves an iterative approach with cost consultants, business development consultants, these days with people called activity planners, who are looking at what the outcomes and in terms of community, individuals and community benefits are, so that those can be provided to the funding organisations who are particularly looking at those. So the process is an iterative one, and other tasks need to be carried out at the same time. There's a little diagram, I won't go through it in any more detail, that shows how those work diagrammatically, and you can see that when you can have a look at this document afterwards. So what other tasks you need to do? Well, obviously, actually getting simple measured surveys. It's not so simple nowadays because these are all done by lasers, but they have the advantage that they can be produced in 3D formats, which allow you to really help your consultation process, and later down, further on down the line, will allow you to look at things like the interpretation, how you explain the buildings to people who come to visit them, and maybe people who don't have access to them. Conservation statements and conservation management plans. These will be a prerequisite of you going forward into the funding process. I don't like the conservation management plans being done too early, in part because some of the funding agencies, particularly the National Lottery Heritage Fund, will fund them. So get through the first gateway of the HLF and ask them to help fund this. But also, the essence of a conservation management plan, in my view, is that it should take account of the totality of the issues facing a building, not just simply take the physical and heritage asset value of the building. There's no point having a conservation management plan that can't be delivered on a building. I've mentioned management and maintenance plans. Occasionally, one needs to look at heritage impact assessments, particularly if you're doing anything slightly controversial. You're adding a new building to a historic building. How does it impact on that, or a new building in a historic landscape? Business and development plans. You really need to be understanding the numbers. There's no point identifying if you can physically use a building to do something if financially it doesn't make sense. and if it's not going to be sustainable. I mentioned a minute ago activity plans. These are really important these days. These are about what the project delivers other than a completed, beautifully restored building. They're about all the things that people can do en route, community archaeology digs, training, learning programs, volunteering, a huge range of activities. And then a few others, obviously ecology, sustainability strategy. Again, how are you going to make sure that your historic buildings carefully tuned into our sustainability issues today? And lastly, one that's often forgotten but it's critical is VAT consultancy. 20% will get added to the cost of your project in VAT. You need to find a way around that. The next bit is quite simple, really. Many of you will be doing, and indeed Hannah laid out how the London Trust works on a revolving basis, whereby you develop the building and then you sell it on and you use the receipts that you get to fund your next building. That's fine, but some of the funders claw back the grants, so you need to be aware of that. It means that you don't take a long-term asset value, and very often this act of conserving a historic building changes the nature of the place around it and changes people's perception of it and changes values. If you sell it immediately on completion, you don't take the benefit of that longer-term growth in the asset value. There is less access to grant aid because you may not be able to provide public access. You might be able to provide things like that, which are of value to funders. And you may lose potential future income. So it's back to that equation again. When you come to a revolving fund project, value equals cost minus grants. The other alternative is to actually keep the building. Many trusts do this, some very successfully. Here, you put the effort in, you develop it, you are able then to secure a long-term income from it. It enhances in value over time, so your risk and effort is rewarded. You can very often 100% fund it, so whatever income you get at the end of the day, which can be substantial, is yours to use after looking after the building and covering the building's costs. And it builds a portfolio for your organisation, which grows and grows in value. And it's a visible and a long-term investment in your community. So you have to choose which of those two routes you go down. The former is relatively quick and clean. The latter needs more thought, but has longer lasting benefits. I'm going to talk through very quickly this project, which is one of the things about third sectors is that very often some of the funding organisations think third sector organisations are a bit dippy and can't put anything together, you know, not very well managed, all the rest of it. But my experience is that third sector organisations can take on the most challenging conservation projects without exception. This is a cemetery in Bristol. It's the second ever Act of Parliament cemetery built in 1832 at Arnos Vale. The first one was in London. And if you imagine yourself as an architect trying to design a cemetery, when before everyone was buried in churches, what do you do? And this early drawing shows it was conceived as an Arcadian Greek landscape, i.e. heaven, as where you're going to be buried. In a terrible state of repair after years and years of neglect by a really recalcitrant owner. 45 acres of cemetery, grade 1 listed historic landscape, 6 grade 2 star listed buildings. Immense public concern about it. Somewhere in the region of 500,000 burials there in Bristol. And if you're a Bristolian, you're almost certain to have a member of your family there. So the owner who wanted to develop the cemetery for housing was a pretty unpopular person, as you can see from this public movement. It's quite a big cemetery, 45 acres. The historic part was a bit with all the little numbers on, and it was extended. And this gives you some idea of the befores and afters. This was a project that cost about £10 million. It was initiated with an options appraisal by that we were commissioned to do by the City Council, who had no idea how to deal with the owner of the cemetery or with the public outrage that was going on. And it identified the route of the third sector project. It looked at the costs and it looked at uses. And we were able to implement that. This is one of the chapels finished, that's now a performance place, as well as providing for services because it's still consecrated. And this is the non-conformist chapel with a new glazed entrance to get down to the basement. The basement with one of the cremators, because it was turned into a crematorium in the 1920s. Public love that, find it very interesting. And then the landscape conserved, paths reinstated, the tombs immediately adjacent to the pathways restored using voluntary labour, and a wide range of other non-financial sources of labour. So quite a substantial project. It needed explanation. It's open to the public, and it's really successful. This gives you some idea of where the costs went in terms of the buildings, the landscape, project management fees, and an idea of where the money came from. A lot of sources, but you can see the lottery, a major part of it. Now, what's really interesting to me, and I think is something that we just don't study enough, is what happens after these places open. What is their impact? There's over 100,000 people every year go to Honest Cemetery, including 23,000 school visits. It was £10.5 million to do. The local authority didn't put any capital towards the main costs. They provided an endowment of £3 million to underpin the ongoing running costs, because clearly a cemetery isn't going to be viable if you can't bury people in it. Over 4,000 man days, volunteer man days put in. It's become the most heavily used wedding venue in Bristol, believe it or not. Nobody had that in the business plan, I can tell you. But it turned out that it's a nice place, beautiful landscape. And of course, Granny's perhaps buried up the road and up the path, and you might feel that she was there. Interestingly, the property values here increased by 35% over and above the general property price increase. In other words, it made a huge impact around it. Major programs of guided walks. It's a fantastic amenity, family history centre, fitness, adult learning, and it's now a huge amenity asset. Now, we've talked about consultation quite a lot, and I was going to talk a little bit more about it, but I'm not going to dwell on it. But you'll have noticed in my 3 stages, each one included consultation. And that's in a large part because where projects let consultation shape their outcomes, they are, in my doubt, much better. There is a greater level of community engagement, and then a greater level of long-term ownership. It's only valuable consultation, though, if you listen to it and you respond to it. In other words, you build it in. It's important to manage expectations through the consultation process. You can't deliver everybody's dreams in these projects, and you have to keep your feet on the ground. But you can also use it to solve some of the most difficult issues if you do it properly. So consultation takes many, many forms. It's really worth doing. One of the things that we like doing very early on is actually to set up with the client a consultation and engagement plan right from the outset, so you can track how that goes through. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about viability and sustainability because that's going to be a subject of yours next week, but it's fundamental to these projects. And there are 2 different meanings. Viability is about the values. Is the end result of your building worth more than it cost you after you allow for grants? Now, the end result of the building being worth more means not just money, as I said earlier, it means what it delivers in terms of outcomes. This is a great place to be, those sorts of things. And then sustainability is about, once the building's complete, will it look after itself? Will you be able to operate it successfully? Will you be able to carry out the long-term maintenance? And will you be able to invest in a sinking fund that in 30, 40 years' time pays for the roof? Because all those things are going to be important to your your funders and to you as an organisation. I won't talk much about this, but these are some of the, and you can read them. These are some of the rules that I have, the implications that I like to see. For one thing, try not to borrow money unless it's short term to cover your cash flow while you're developing it, because these projects are always marginal in their viability. So don't borrow. Don't rely on external revenue grant sources in your calculations because they can be cut off. By all means, build your own revenue grant sources in and use them, but don't rely on other ones. I've mentioned community engagement, and I've also, through the study, I've talked about things like enabling development to deliver you endowments and things like that. If you have to phase your project, it's really sensible to spend the capital where it generates returns earliest. So you need to be sensible and not idealistic. When you're taking risks, you do need to exercise caution in their evaluation. But don't forget, these projects are inherently risky. They are going to have risks. You cannot de-risk them, but you do need to do your best to mitigate them and minimize them. I've mentioned most of these other things. Make sure your project has the potential for renewal and refreshing. Museum projects particularly suffer from a curve where they're very popular initially. The curve dies off. You need, as it dies off, to be able to reinvigorate the process. And that accounts to many other uses. Understanding the markets we've talked about, and maximizing the use of non-financial resources. I showed you Clevedon Pier earlier. The volunteer work that went on that pier was fantastic. There are 24 cast iron lamp standards down the pier. Those are entirely, the ones that are there now were remade from castings that were made by volunteers, from patterns made by volunteers, from samples that were found on the seabed damaged. And of course, hard work. So what are the key things for you to solve, just to summarize it then? Firstly, ownership and acquisition. That is going to be difficult. It may require you to go down the route of compulsory purchase order with all that will entail. It may not, and it will have all sorts of timescales attached to it. Compulsory purchase order will probably take you 3 or 4 years. We've talked about building your capacity and capability. Don't be afraid to say, I need some help, and because the funders will be looking at you to see whether you do or not. Be really careful about defining what the sustainable uses are, and be rigorous and realistic in your planning. Finding the capital funding takes a huge amount of effort. It isn't just a question of writing to the lottery and getting a cheque back by return of post. Anyone will tell you that if you want to get a major grant out of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, it will take you at least 2.5 to 3 years before you get the letter saying we'll fund your project. So these timescales are important. We've talked about public access to your project, agreeing acceptable levels of change, consultation, engagement, building momentum and maintaining it. I mentioned just a second ago about how long it takes to get lottery funding. You've got to keep things going while you're waiting for the letters to come through. So building little steps that you can celebrate all the way through your project, celebrating people's efforts, people's contributions through community archaeology, whatever they do, record it and celebrate it and maintain it. These projects have to be driven by quality at every level, and they have to balance realism with vision. So in your work, in all your scoping, your planning, those are the things that you really need to look out. Now, just one last example of a project, just to show you what can be done. This is Cardigan Castle, the home of the first ever recorded Eisteddfod in Wales. In a terrible state of repair, its walls propped up with raking shores that closed the main road into Cardigan, a little town with 4,000 inhabitants. This was a photograph taken in the 1970s, and that was its condition then. And it got worse and worse. As you can see. This project started with an options appraisal, which looked at this quite complex site. It's about 5 acres on the edge of Cardigan, The castle walls are partly collapsed. There are 6 Grade 2 style listed buildings within its gardens, within the castle walls, and the gardens were reputedly designed by Nash in the Regency period. As you can see, quite a lot of buildings, quite a lot of site to plan. The options appraisal really focused on the individual buildings in the castle. It was fairly clear at the start that some sort of heritage asset value or heritage visitor asset would be worth looking at, because Welsh interest in the Eisteddfod, the building was owned, had been CPO'd by the local council, who hadn't been able to do anything with it. And essentially, the options appraisal looked at how you could put together a range of different uses, some of them based on visitor income. And the visitor income would not be sufficient to cover the place's costs, both operational and maintenance, and then revenue generating income like holiday lets, studio workspaces, conferencing, to build a holistic complementary package of activities. And this is the building on completion. It was undertaken by a trust called the Cadogan Trust. They were a tiny, tiny local organisation. A local school teacher, editor of the local newspaper, a domestic science teacher, Dickie the vet, the local vet. No particular experience between them, but they stuck at it and over 12 years produced this fantastic outcome. This is the interior of the house, partly used for exhibitions and display and partly used for conferencing. Everything beautifully restored. These are the holiday lets. Very high standard, quality again everywhere. Some small business workspace, a new restaurant that was built as part of the project, overlooking the river, medieval towers incorporated. All the gardens and landscaping were done over a 5-year period by volunteers under supervision of an HLF funded gardener, including kitchen gardens and greenhouses. It gives you some idea where the funds came from. Very, very complex packaging of funding, not just funding. I would stress the resources. You can see significant amount of volunteer time went into it. And then here's the pie chart. Again, you'll see the lottery grant, a big proportion of it. This had a European Union grant, which are now effectively being picked up by things like the Levelling Up grants and the Town Fund grant. So again, quite an interesting pie chart. You see that the council put no capital costs in, and that was because during the options appraisal, the parallel business development plan showed that even with all the visitor numbers anticipated and with the uses proposed to generate income, it would still not wash its face in the long term. So Cardigan Council, Ceredigion Council, its commitment was to underpin the long-term business plan through freehold responsibility clauses in the main lease to the trust. So the council stayed responsible for the main castle walls, the external fabric of the building afterwards. That was all informed by the early work in feasibility studies, sorry, the options appraisal and the business planning studies. Again, just to emphasize the impact of these projects, looking back at them, because it's really important. Even during the contract, we had 20,000 visitors to the site. The contract spend in the town was 8.5 million. The local Indian restaurant sold 3,000 takeaway lunches to the workforce, and he proudly tells me that he bought his brand new second-hand Mercedes-Benz on the basis of the extra lunches that he sold. Permanent jobs, physical changes to the town that at an early stage has removed the raking shore to the town, to the castle walls, which reopened the centre of the town to 2 lanes of traffic. Huge amount of volunteer scheme, a community archaeology scheme that ran for 2 years with over 400 participants. So even before it opened, a lot of real interest and activity. And then since it's been opening, it's been attracting, until COVID, over 45,000. Its peak year was about 60. with a massive local spend. Events, leisure learning activities, Welsh classes, for example. The holiday units have been let, this was at the end of 2019, over 4,200 times. So look at the income and the ongoing benefits that this delivers. And the very, very palpable sense of pride that people in Cardigan now have in their castle. Not least of which is that many of them now work there. They get in there free because they're local residents. And then lastly, if you take the income that the project generates, for each of the inhabitants of Cardigan, that project has effectively increased their average annual local income by 15%. So a massive impact. So those are the prizes, but they're only won by starting in a responsible way and working really carefully through the whole process of scoping the project, understanding its business, and making sure that you get those early answers right and leave yourself the flexibility to adapt as the project goes forward, because these projects take a long time. This one took 12 years from when we first went for the interview for the options appraisal to when it opened in June 2015. So, as I said, at Cardigan, there were lots of happy faces and lots of hard work, and they're happy again now with COVID being lifted. So I hope that's given you some idea of the route and some of the studies and work that you'll need to take into account on the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you very much. I just wanted to know if anyone had any questions. Oh, could you stop sharing your screen and then I can see everyone's faces again? I didn't see any in the chat.
No, can I just ask, obviously there's quite a small committed community group at Cardigan. Did they spend or take on a project manager at any point, or did they do a lot of the work on their own voluntary time to get the project particularly through the early stages?
They did two things. They, as we got funding through the lottery, they took on an internal project director and admin staff. And as part of the overall project team, they, but primarily to look after the construction side, they took on an external project manager. So they had an internal project director and a project manager. Mm. It's quite a big project, and of course there are lots of aspects. There's a big interpretation part of the work involving oral histories and community activities and things like that, which the Castle's project director looked after. The Welsh for Adults language classes, all those things that were built into the project. And then the project manager, external project manager, looked primarily after the capital works spend.
I mean, I had a couple of things. I mean, I know from the work that we do, in terms of you talked a lot about, you know, the options appraisal process. And I suppose I know from the work that LHBT does that the options appraisals, which are for quite small buildings, can actually take, I think, Rosie, around 6 months or so to deliver. So they're not short pieces of work. I mean, I can only imagine what the options appraisals must have been like for the cemetery and Cardigan Castle. I can imagine much longer.
Yeah, definitely much longer. About 2 years.
Yeah, okay.
Quite substantial documents. Somebody just asked a question about did the feasibility study, was the end result the same as the feasibility, the options appraisal outlined? And particularly at Cardigan, it was very close. And certainly at the time the project was delivered, the uses that were there were all exactly the same as had been mapped out in the original options appraisal, not necessarily in the same places. And the only change subsequently has been that the holiday lets have been so successful that the artisan workspaces that were put in the stable block were replaced by redeveloping those for holiday lets as well. and but the outcomes were very close. And I think that's important.
And I think in terms of funding an options appraisal, just thinking about it, it is that difficult situation where there's not many funders out there who will fund this really early work. And I think we did talk about this actually on the previous training workshop. You do have those few funders that will help with sort of initial viability and options appraisal studies. So the Architectural Heritage Fund, but at the moment they have quite a specific programme on relating to high streets. And I think the lottery also will also consider funding options appraisals. Is that the case, Rosie? We've had some funding before, haven't we, from the lottery?
Yeah, I'm going to talk through that actually on the case study through, because they've got their small grants programme, which is good to approach. But in terms of the options appraisal funding for these much bigger projects, actually I'd be interested to know how the finances stack up, because with the Heritage Fund it's quite defined with their small development stage, capital stage funding. And actually when you need a hefty bit of work, you need that big investment at early stage, and I imagine that's not easy.
Well, for the two projects I showed you, in the one case, Cardigan Castle, the building had been derelict for nearly 100 years, and it was CPO'd by the local authority, who'd held it for about 7 or 8 years without finding a solution. And the other one, it was a privately owned cemetery, but the city of Bristol were under huge pressure from the community, very, very significant pressure to do something about it. So in both of those cases, the local council funded significantly the initial options appraisals and business development planning to get the thing going. On a case like Clevedon Pier, the background there was that the group that became the trust that took the pier had fought the local authority at a public inquiry to demolish it. So there's no way the local authority were going to cough up for any money for an options appraisal. So that all had to be funded through organisations like the Historic England were very helpful, the Architectural Heritage Fund, and sources like that. So it varies. The lottery does help, particularly if you are an existing organisation and you go for what they call resilient funding.
There's a couple of questions that have just popped up, and I think if we tackle them, I'm aware that we're running a little bit behind time. Helen's asked, are funding bodies such as the Lottery Fund on board with starting with the revenue generating aspects of a project? I know that sometimes planning consents can limit enabling development to ensure that the community benefit aspect doesn't get left behind.
Right, well, certainly the National Lottery Heritage Fund is very anxious that projects succeed. And they are, at Cardigan Castle, they were entirely comfortable with funding all the commercial aspects of the project. So those holiday lets, everything you saw in that picture, down to the coal bucket in the grate or the log basket, the lottery paid 52.5% of. That was the intervention rate. So they want, if your project is a good one, if it delivers on the heritage asset value and it delivers on the outcomes, then the lottery are quite comfortable doing that. The new build cafe at the castle was also funded by the lottery on the same intervention rate. So occasionally you have to juggle the way funders contribute to a project to make sure that you have all your costs covered. So for example, at Cardigan, the European Union wouldn't fund anything that looked like state aid to activities that might then compete with other activities locally. So we had to take the holiday lets out of the EU funding, and the lottery funded a higher proportion of those costs. So, you know, there is quite a lot of manipulation needed in terms of the funding. And you can have projects where you've actually got what looks like all the funding, but you've still got gaps because some of the funders are not prepared to fund a particular bit of it.
Mm.
So it is difficult. We have done lottery funded projects where there's an enabling development. So at a place called Bank Hall in Bretherton in Lancashire, the Heritage Trust for the Northwest got consent to build, I think it's 23 new houses, which cross-funded the conservation deficit of the restoration of the main house, along with a lottery grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I started that project nearly 20 years ago, and the completed apartments have just gone on the market last month.
Wow, okay.
So it tells you.
Wow. And final question from Tim. What do you think went wrong at Hastings Pier? And I think that's in reference to the fact that the charity went into administration.
Yeah, I think the very last thing on my presentation, the last words of my written presentation, there was a lack of realism about it.
Okay.
I don't think it was architecturally driven rather than use and community driven. And it was it didn't ever properly balance revenue streams and things like that. I have to say piers are pretty difficult.
Sure, yeah.
not only did I organise the work for Clevedon Pier, but I ended up as a trustee and a chairman of the trust for 30 years. And but we did operate it very successfully. Well, we do operate it very successfully. I've retired as a trustee, and it always made good operating profits. The problem with it was that the cyclical maintenance costs of a pier like that are astronomical. Just redecorating the pier costs nearly £1 million. So even if you're putting away, $100,000 a year into your reserve fund, it gets a stretch. You can only repaint it every 10 years, plus all the other. So I think Hastings got caught by that as well. But lack of realism and lack of gluing it down to the realities of what could be achieved, I think.
Sometimes I suppose actually it might be worthwhile considering what went wrong in some places to help with others going forward to get it right. But that's an interesting insight.
I was going to add a slide to mine, but it was getting too long, and the slide was going to be about precedent.
Yeah.
Whenever we do a study, we always go and try an options appraisal. We always go and try and look at precedent. Where has it been done elsewhere? How have people done it well elsewhere? And more importantly, where have they done it? Where have they got it wrong? What have they done badly? How can we avoid doing it badly? So, learning from mistakes is the only way you learn. You don't really learn from your excesses.
Yeah,
so go and look at things. And, there's lots of, the other thing about our particular world that we live in is people are very willing to help each other. If one of your attendees wanted information on Cardigan and wanted to go and visit and meet somebody, they would be delighted. Likewise, the peer, sharing their experiences is a really important part of what they do.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned that in the first workshop actually, that speak to other other groups and organisations just to get that feedback on that.